So welcome to the next panel. And I think we covered a lot of topics already today that are super exciting, many different angles that we looked at the Zeitenwende, the question of whether it's profound, whether it will be sustainable, whether it will be a continuity or change in German foreign policy. We have talked about different perceptions of Germany as a security actor in the region. But I think where we can probably get a little bit more insights, we partly covered that also in various panels, but I think where we can get a bit more insights is on some explanations of why Germany is doing what it's doing and or not doing. And in that sense, the next panel will focus a bit more on the German domestic politics. So that's where we will zoom in a little, in party politics, in election campaigns, different angles. And I guess the question will be then whether our panelists will provide us with more insights on different angles. And I would right away, in order not to kill too much time, pass on to Wolfgang Wagner. Wolfgang Wagner is professor of international security at the University of Amsterdam, but he is a German by origin, by birth, and has a very long expertise on German foreign policy. Since his dissertation, he looked at European security and defense policy and studied intensively party politics, and I will pass on the floor to you then right away.
Okay, and thanks for the clarification. So I didn't cheer for benevolence yesterday, so no worries. And thanks for having me to this conference. And I already learned a lot today. I also noted that there's a lot of talk about what Germany wants, what other states do, etc. And this, of course, is in line with a widespread tendency to treat states as unitary actors. And what I want to do is to zoom in closer, and then what happens is that it very much depends on who you ask and who is in government, or more precisely, who is part of the government coalition. So what I'm interested in is internal division, dividing lines, who is supporting, who is opposing, Zeitenwende and some of the sub-projects of this. And I will particularly focus on political parties, because in the end, they are the one who aggregate citizen preferences and who bundle them into more or less coherent ideologies, and they compete in elections, of course. I assume you are familiar more or less with the German parties and the German party system, but as a quick recap, and here I draw on data that was collected by colleagues of mine, former colleagues of mine, with an expert survey to map political parties on two dimensions: the left-right dimension, which is mainly about the economy, and then what's called here Galtern, somewhat technical term, is about sociocultural, conservative or liberal positions. And you can see that, now, of course, the AfD is the most conservative cultural one. At the time of this expert survey, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht wasn't part of the panel yet. But the whole point of this Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht is to move the Linke further to the conservative end of the socio-cultural dimension. As a political scientist, I'm interested in finding data to analyze, and one really wonderful source is voting data in parliament, or more precisely, roll call votes. So these votes in parliament where every single member's voting behavior is recorded. There are not that many in the Bundestag, but the high-profile decisions are taken as roll call votes. So I put on this and the next slide the results from the two, I would say, key votes on the Zeitenwende. And this is one vote from April on supporting Ukraine. And this is not only support symbolically, but it is already asking for the delivery of heavy weapons to Ukraine. And you can see, not surprisingly, the governing coalition plus the Christian Democrats voting in favor, and you have opposition from the two fringes of the political spectrum, the radical left and the radical right. And on the related question that we discussed in the course of today already a couple of times, the increase in defense spending. You see a somewhat similar picture, but you also see dissenting votes even in the government coalition. So I think these two graphs tell an interesting story in the sense that even within the government coalition, and especially amongst the Social Democrats, there is some opposition to the key project of the defense budget, and this is the surplus budget of 100 billion that was voted on here. And then also very interesting is that the radical right is actually internally divided, and this is a divide that cuts across an east-west divide as well. So in the AfD, you have a couple of members in parliament who also have served in the armed forces. Some of them have made a career in the armed forces. Wundrak is one of them, and I had a background talk with him once, and I find he's very representative of this group. So they are typically old West German citizens, culturally very conservative, but then in the AfD you also have, of course, many representatives from the new Länder, from East Germany, and they are far more prepared to accommodate Putin's Russia and Russian interest than the former Western European members of the AfD. And the Linke, the radical left, is pretty much united in its opposition to the Zeitenwende. So where does this opposition come from? And I think if we look into the ideological foundations of this opposition, you find various sources. So within the Social Democratic Party, you still have a very strong group of MPs who are maybe not pacifists in the strict sense of the word, but anti-militarists. So they really dislike the idea that too much money is going to the military. Rolf Mützenich, the chair of the party group in the Bundestag, is a key figure in this respect. And long before Zeitenwende was announced in the previous legislative period, key more hawkish figures within the Social Democratic Party, Felgentreu, Bartels, resigned from their positions, for example, in opposition to the Social Democrats' motion that they wouldn't support the acquisition of armed drones for the Bundestag, or they were no longer voted again into their position. So Bartels was the ombudsman for the armed forces, and his mandate was not renewed due to opposition from within the Social Democrats. Then you have the radical left opposition, and if you're interested in the ideological foundation of this opposition, Oscar Lafontaine's, one of his books is a good guide. It doesn't need a translation into English because the title is Amigo Ho, and it points to the foundation of radical left's opposition to Zeitenwende, which is essentially anti-Americanism. The argument in the book, in a nutshell, is that the root cause of all evil is American capitalism, and if something bad happens, such as Russia invading Ukraine, it might look like Russia is the aggressor, but if you dig deep enough, it's all American capitalism. So it's actually opposing the current neoliberal system that Russia stands for, and this is why the radical left can't support Zeitenwende. And then you have the opposition from the radical right, from the AfD, and there are a couple of ideational streams coming together. One is a kind of isolationism, so the emphasis on this not being in German interest to be involved in any way in this war. But it's also a very deep-seated acceptance of inequalities that applies to domestic politics, but also to international relations. So the idea that great powers do what great powers do, and smaller states have to accept what smaller states have to accept. So a kind of realist notion of international relations. And on top of this comes a priority for the welfare state when it comes to spending decisions. If you recall these voting graphs, you could say, well, both sources of opposition from the radical left, radical right, are not that significant because they are minorities in the overall picture. And with the split of the Linke and the establishment of Bündnis Sarah-Wagenknecht, it could even be the case that in the next Bundestag there's no radical left because they don't pass the 5% threshold. But to understand why these two sources of opposition nevertheless have a huge impact on the overall discourse, it is important to realize that they score very high in the East German Länder. Of course, polls shift over time, but it could be that the AfD gains as much as 30+%, and the Bündnis Sarah-Wagenknecht around 15%. It could be the case that neither the Greens nor the Liberals make it into the parliaments of the Länder. And then you have a very traumatic situation in these Länder where it's very difficult to imagine a coalition that wouldn't include one of these two radical parties. So I think if you analyze this in terms of an overall policy space, it is clear that these radical positions also have an impact on how the other parties position themselves, and they can draw on previous traditions. This is an election campaign poster from 2004, so just a year after Schröder then opposed German participation in the Iraq War, and peace, Friedensmacht became a slogan for the Social Democrats. And you can see that this recipe for success, and for Schröder it was definitely the case, is now picked up by various parties. And these are all campaign posters from the recent campaign for the European Parliament. And you can see that the Social Democrats, the AfD, the Linke, and Bündnis Sarah-Wagenknecht essentially all compete for being the party responsible for keeping the peace, which in essence means that Zeitenwende is definitely not a priority for them. And for these reasons, I'm a bit more skeptic that the Zeitenwende will have a huge future in Germany. I think that support, whatever's been there in terms of support, risks to be wound down in the near future. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and that sort of corresponds to Timo Graf's presentation. And so there seems to be really the parliamentary vote and public opinion seems to be in sync in that sense to some extent. So we come to our next speaker, Dr. Benjamin Tallis, who is at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and there he heads the action group Zeitenwende. So he will provide us with really deep expert knowledge on the Zeitenwende. Dr. Benjamin Tallis got his PhD at the University of Manchester and had various previous positions in Prague, Berlin, Hamburg, and in that function was also advisor to the German government on the future of European security.
Thank you very much indeed. What a pleasure it is to be here today, and it's already been a really interesting discussion with a number of different perspectives on the present of the Zeitenwende and the future of the Zeitenwende. And I think what I'm going to say now follows on quite nicely from what was just said by Wolfgang Wagner. So ignoring the title that is in the program, because it's not actually applicable to this discussion as it's evolved throughout the day, what I would really like to talk about is indeed, what is the Zeitenwende? What do we mean when we're talking about that, and how do we assess its progress, and how do we assess its future? So that's a lot to run through in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. There's a key question also of whose Zeitenwende we're talking about. And that's not just in Germany, that's around Europe too. And that might seem a strange question to pose, given that the Baltic states, the Nordics, didn't have the same failure of threat perception that Germany had previously. But nonetheless, there have been changes that they are living through. Most obviously in the Nordic case, the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO is often described as their own Zeitenwende. But I'm going to put it to you at the end that there's another Zeitenwende happening in relation to the Baltics and Central Eastern Europe as well. But coming back to focus on Germany, there's again two kinds of Zeitenwende here. There's the Zeitenwende that happens to us, the change of which we're the objects of, the change in the world that was what Olaf Scholz's speech announcing the Zeitenwende responded to, particularly occasioned or illustrated by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So that is the the passive Zeitenwende, if you like, the one that happens to us. But then there's the active Zeitenwende. And this is what Scholz's speech launched, was a process of change, a process of responding to that external change that also became known as the Zeitenwende. And that's the Zeitenwende that you do. That is the Zeitenwende as task. And that is what we've spent quite some time at the DGAP looking into. And I'm going to put it straight up front, bottom line up front, that Zeitenwende has failed. There has not been a change that could be referred to as a significant turning point or a sea change in German foreign and security policy, but also German policy and positioning, strategic mindset, geopolitical worldview more widely. That change has not happened. As a friend of mine who studied religious studies said to me, theologian here, you can't write about what doesn't exist. But God knows we've tried over the last couple of years at the DGAP. So we've tried in the action group Zeitenwende, which has brought together serving politicians from the democratic parties, so the parties that were just mentioned, excluding the AfD, the Linke, and the Alliance of Sarah Wagenknecht, officials from various government ministries, experts, both German-based and international, and also businesses and civil society actors, to explore Germany's geostrategic options, but also to try and breathe life into this process. This was not a passive process of study, this was an active process of providing options for change, exploring the consequences of those, and trying to help German actors work with allies to master that transformation. And despite the best efforts of us, but also many others, I don't think it has succeeded. Why do I say that? Well, we put forward frameworks for evaluating the Zeitenwende. We actually tried to make this a systematic process. And I would put it to you that there were 5 aspects of the Zeitenwende that were first launched by Olaf Scholz's speech. One was on Ukraine and supporting Ukraine against Russia's aggression. Second was about German defense. Third was about diversification of energy supply, getting off Russian gas, fundamentally. Fourth was about Germany's positioning in the EU and NATO, and the 5th was about the approach to authoritarian states more widely and dealing with authoritarian threats to democracy. Those, I think, are the 5 key elements you can draw out of that initial speech, and we said you can evaluate each of those across 4 dimensions. The speed of change, the level of ambition of change, the durability of change, and how internationally coordinated it was, how well done it was with allies or not. And obviously people might disagree with that, they might see other things that you could add in or take away, but this we found with our group of experts and political actors to be a useful way to try and evaluate the change that's gone on. Loosely speaking, on Ukraine, we heard in the very first presentation of the day, Germany has become the 2nd largest supporter of Ukraine in absolute terms. And that is something that you will hear time and again in Berlin and from Berlin talking to other allies. And that's true. And Germany has overcome some of its own taboos in terms of sending weapons to support Ukraine. But if Germany had really thrown itself into this fight, you would expect Europe's largest economy to be the largest contributor. But what we've also can see very clearly is that in terms relative to GDP, Germany is only in the mid-rank. It is nowhere near the top compared to some of the other contributors that have been there. Nonetheless, it has spent a huge amount of money, 56 billion euros by April, which is an enormous amount. But you will consistently hear from Berlin, we don't get the credit for this. And I can tell you why. Because Germany has not committed to Ukraine's victory. It has not thrown itself behind the team goal. Olaf Scholz has still not said Ukraine should win and Russia must lose. Instead, he uses the reverse formulation, which has confused the public, irritated allies, and frustrated German strategy of saying Russia must not win and Ukraine must not lose. And even though they sound similar, they're a world away in terms of what you can do with those things politically and what they imply in terms of action. So, not a good picture on Ukraine, the first dimension, even though it must be acknowledged Germany has done a lot. It's nowhere near what needs to be done to actually achieve that victory. Second, on energy diversification. If you were to point to a success of the Zeitenwende, this is probably where you would look. And I know the previous panel was about energy. We can look at the installation of those LNG terminals, the floating terminals in the Ostsee. And even Olaf Scholz pointed to this, saying this is an indication of the Neue Deutschlandgeschwindigkeit, the new German speed. So there was one of our speed categories that we talked about before. And as I mentioned earlier in the day, we wrote a piece in 2022 specifically criticizing the speed of the German transformation, saying Germany was moving at the speed of shame. Well, Scholz struck back, the LNG terminals came, he said, look, this is the new German speed. I said, okay, so where there is a will, there is a way. But don't forget that it was Russia that actually turned off the tap fully and helped Germany get off that gas. What hasn't happened in the energy aspect of the transformation is finding a long-term solution that is geopolitically as well as geoeconomically and ecologically sustainable. What we've seen is the use of coal to plug the gap while turning off nuclear. We've seen new dependencies created on countries such as Azerbaijan and Qatar, which, while not as aggressive as Russia, are not states that share our values. So there's a question there about how long-term sustainable that is. How am I doing for time? Just checking. Sorry? Very good. There has been big progress in installing renewables. Although Germany's progress in this has slowed somewhat, we have to give credit where credit is due. There are a lot of renewables in Germany, and it generated over 50% of its electricity for the first time from renewable sources a couple of years ago. This is a good sign, but it's also problematic because Germany's green transition is highly dependent on critical process materials and technologies and components from China. That dependency is not addressed by anyone seeking to actually create a long-term energy solution to Germany's economic problems that come from the cost of electricity generation and try and marry it together with a sensible geopolitical view. So there is a contradiction there that has not actually been solved as part of the Zeitenwende. So even in the section that looks the most promising, there's still quite a lot of work that would have to be done. In terms of approach to authoritarian states, that dependency on China in the energy sector is replicated in other sectors. There is big market dependency on China, and what we've seen is since the release of the government's China strategy, which left de-risking, as it's known, up to individual companies, many of those companies said, thanks very much. Here's what, for example, Ola Källenius, head of Mercedes-Benz, said he considers de-risking: more exposure to China. That wouldn't have been my definition of de-risking, I have to say. And a lot of German tier one companies seem to be banking on being too big and also too German to be allowed to fail by the German government. And so are loading on risk, which is actually put on the population for the pursuit of their own private interests at the moment. The picture is more mixed across the Mittelstand, across the small and medium-sized enterprises, but there is a big unanswered question about dependencies on China, which put the sources of Germany's prosperity into conflict with the sources of its security. If something were to happen in the Taiwan Strait, both Germany's green transition and its trade model would be under extreme strain, to put it very mildly. In terms of Russia, yes, there is not much business with Russia at the moment, although some companies are doing business there, but there remains a lingering suspicion that in certain parts of the German political and business establishment, there would be a desire to go back to some form of business as usual. That has not been comprehensively dispelled, let's say, and it's certainly not been dispelled among allies. I also hear a lot of complaints around Central and Eastern European capitals that they see Germany making the same kind of mistakes with China as it had made with Russia. So this economic dependency in particular. Moving swiftly on, and as I said, this is a lightning quick survey, so pick the holes in it in the questions and comments and come assault me with it afterwards. In terms of German role and positioning within the EU and NATO, this has not been resolved. Germany has rarely, I think, been more adrift from some of its key partners within the European Union, taking different positions to them, blocking their initiatives while providing few of its own. Only a very recent example of this would be on common borrowing for European defence spending, which caused an enormous row at the last EU Council meeting, where Olaf Scholz aligned with Mark Rutte to block the proposal that was there from the Central East Europeans and the French. In NATO, Germany is also not living up to its commitments, or doesn't have the capability to live up to its commitments, and has been seen as a block on Ukraine's membership of the alliance, putting it directly at odds with the Central East Europeans and the Nordics, and also to an extent with the UK and France. So there's a certain sense of isolation and still the need to find a role, which has not been answered by the Zeitenwende process. You'll notice I've left defense to last, and this is also, I'm afraid to say, not necessarily a happy picture. The 100 billion euro special fund that we've heard so much about is a 100 billion fund that has been spent on an old shopping list that is supposed to fill a gap of about 650 billion that was not spent on defense in the previous 20 years. Unsurprisingly, it's not enough. The biggest single ticket item upon which that fund has been spent so far is interest and debt payments. There has been procurement, things have been spent, the F-35s, the Chinooks. Some money has been spent on ammunition, but only about 5% of what is needed to be spent on ammunition to get Bundeswehr stocks up to the proper level it's estimated they need. Moreover, we don't see the long-term commitment to meeting the 2% target. We've just seen Boris Pistorius ask for 6.5 billion as an extra increase and be given 1 billion, which doesn't cover the rise in inflation. So there's big questions about the seriousness of the commitment to building a Bundeswehr that could actually deliver on Germany's self-proclaimed special responsibility for European security, which is what we heard in the national security strategy, that many people, myself included, wouldn't say was a particularly strategic document. It was a very good description of a lot of the problems that we see in the world. It did not prioritize, it did not allocate funding, and it did not give a clear, unified vision of the world. In fact, it contained two visions of the world, one of multipolarity and one of systemic rivalry, the two of which are in competition. And this is where I would close, is it's that lack of particular vision. It's that lack of an idea about the kind of world that Germany would like to create and be part of creating, the kind of Europe Germany would like to see and the role that it would play in it that has plagued the Zeitenwende process. The Zeitenwende speech, to go back to the very beginning, was given at a time of panic in Berlin, 27th of February, 3 days after the invasion. It was estimated by most German ministries at that time that Kiev would fall, that Ukraine would not be able to fight. So there would be a much more direct danger to Germany that needed to be prepared for. You get to March, when the Russians retreat from Kiev, 29th of March. The air goes out of the Zeitenwende process. There is no urgency after that. There is no clear, dedicated action after that. And so I think it's not right to be able to talk about a Zeitenwende in Germany. Where there has been a Zeitenwende, and this is my very closing remark, is in the countries that were counting on Germany to do more. And to give actually the ultimate compliment, given their history, so this is Poland, this is the Baltic states, the countries that we're seeing today, to say we want more Germany. That's a huge compliment. Building up what Radek Sikorski said 12 years ago at the DGAP, we fear German inaction more than German power, that has been a consistent message over the last 2 years. Now those countries are starting not to care. They say, we're going ahead, come with us if you want, it will make it easier. But Germany risks making itself geopolitically irrelevant, despite its economic heft, because it has not been able to change to meet the moment. There are politicians across all the parties that were mentioned before, the four democratic parties, who understand this and who do want change and who want the kind of pressure that Timo Graf spoke about before to help drive that change forward. So as a message to allies, is keep pushing. You do have allies to work with in Berlin, but don't give credit for what has not happened. There has been no Zeitenwende. Thank you.
So here we had a very skeptical view on the Zeitenwende, and we are looking forward to our next speaker, Dr. Tobias Krämer, who we can applaud now or congratulate because he just has been elected to the European Parliament. Congratulations. But the reason why he was invited here, I think, was that up until now he was then the Baltic desk officer at the German Federal Foreign Office. And I would like to mention that he's alumni from Cambridge. He got his master's and PhD in political science in Cambridge. So we're looking forward to your presentation, which I think you will give us insights on the European election campaign, and so follow up a bit on the presentation from Wolfgang. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. I'll try my best not to succumb to the temptation to spend the next 20 minutes rebuking some of the things that have just been said. I'll try to stick to time because I've been relatively busy the last couple of weeks, it is true. So on the train this morning when I came here, I was thinking what I want to focus on in this talk. And it is, as you already mentioned, it is a bit of a funny feeling to be here in this capacity, because I did indeed spend probably too many years of my 20s in Cambridge, in Peterhouse, doing my master's and my PhD, and having actually been involved also with a center, being on the other side of the organizing end, and then also very often on the more academic end. But it is true that over the last couple of years, my own biography has its own little Zeitenwende, if I dare say so. And that indeed, for me, it was, after the PhD, I was a lecturer at Oxford, teaching politics and international relations. And it was in the early, in February 2022, when I had students who were indeed of Ukrainian origin, who gave up their scholarships or their places in Oxford to go fight for Europe and these values, that it was very clear to me that for me it was, in the first instance, a shift from my very comfortable place of armchair diplomacy as an academic to move at least to desk chair diplomacy in the German Foreign Office. But ultimately, I also told myself that I want to do whatever I can to contribute to this Zeitenwende. It was really for me an inspiring moment to listen to Olaf Scholz. I'll be entirely honest about that, because that is also something that had, I'm a social democrat since I was 14, I should add, but it was also very often one part of my party where I always felt the debate was not fully where I wanted it to be, and I thought it would be a very interesting moment to, at this time, take the plunge into politics and move from armchair diplomacy over desk chair diplomacy into the much more, let's say, harsh world of real politics, and do things from that side. So I thought that instead of doing an apologetics of the Social Democratic Party, which we can very happily go into in the question, I thought that it might indeed be perhaps more interesting for you to hear some of the insights of my own I thought very, very refined academic hypotheses and smart diplomatic musings hitting the reality of an electoral campaign and seeing how that faces up to reality. And I want to focus basically on 3 steps. First of all, I want to have a quick look at the moment of Zeitenwende and what it actually did to do in both the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party, but also in the population. And then I want to focus on the challenges we actually do have domestically right now. And third, because I am an optimist, I want to look at possible ways to anchor Zeitenwende also domestically to make it sustainable in the long run. But first things first, it is true, and I would say in this respect, there has been a Zeitenwende in the minds of many Germans, and I think the data we have seen earlier today have shown this real spike. I am born in the Ruhr Valley, an industrial area. My mother is a Protestant minister who was very much influenced by the peace movement. And having grown up in the SPD, it was actually stunning to me how much this country and this party had changed over just 1.5 years. It is on the ground very clear now that the Zeitenwende is necessary. And it is very clear now that we have to take acts to implement it. And that is coming from a background where pacifism is indeed, not just in the SPD, but in Germany more broadly, a very, very strong part. And I would say also that in the beginning there was also political Zeitenwende. I wouldn't underestimate 100, if you had suggested 100 billion euros into defense in 2021, people would have sent you home. If you had suggested in 2021 that Germany would have a full brigade sent to Lithuania, stationed in Lithuania, people would have said, maybe you should see a shrink. If you would have said in 2021 that a social democratic chancellor is talking, that a social democratic chancellor is giving the speech Olaf Scholz has given, or that a social democratic minister of defense would talk about increasing defense spending of over 3%, I think that too would have been unimaginable. And these are real steps. I agree they are not going far enough, but this is a real change. But what I do share in some of the criticism here is that I think there was a moment in which much of this was possible, and then there were two strategies how to implement the Zeitenwende. The one was very much to say, like, let's create facts. Let's use this moment of a real sense of threat to implement it in a, how we say in German, Hauruck-Verfahren, to put it into place, and then that is the reality. And we will see what happens afterwards. And there are risks to that, and I'll come to them in a second. And the second approach was, and that is that I think in many ways the Chancellor has taken, was what some might call the boiling frog approach, which is to say a gradual build, being very hesitant publicly in rhetoric, but slowly going step by step and having real changes made. But at the same time in the rhetoric, and I thought it was interesting when we looked at the pictures of the word peace, Frieden in Germany. The idea here of the gradual approach was also to not leave this concept of creating peace to the populist right or the populist left, but to make the case that to create peace, you need strength. That the only way why Willy Brandt's peace politics was successful was because he had the military strength behind it, he had the clear alliance with the United States, and they also spent 3% of the GDP on defense. I will agree with you that neither of these attempts seem to have fully worked. And I don't actually think that either of these attempts will work in the long run, and that is for a couple of reasons. I think the Hauruck-Verfahren, the let's create facts, has a massive risk. And that is that it really relies on the situation where people in Germany have this very clear perception of threat. And that was there in 2022. But we also see in the data that that is not that obvious nowadays. That's not necessary to say that this is right or good. I think the threat is existential, but we also have to understand that politics is made in the lived experience of people. And one thing I can tell you is that if you go into the streets and you talk to people, and they see that they have the sense that in public spaces there's a lack of security domestically, if they have the sense that trains don't run, if they have the sense that they can't pay for their bills, if you see pensioners who are collecting bottles to return them to get 25p, if you then just talk to them about security isolatedly, they will tell you there are other priorities. And I think the real risk is that you get into a discussion of butter versus cannons. And it is entirely different if you are in the Baltics. I was the Baltic desk officer, I was there. If you're 30 kilometers from the Russian threat, there is the primacy of foreign policy. It is imminent. You see the threat. If you live in Germany, even more so if you live in Portugal or Italy, it is not that clear, it is not that concrete. It might be just as real, but it is not as concrete. And if we get into a debate where it's butter or cannons, I will tell you we will lose the cannons because people will prefer butter. They might be wrong in doing so, but this will be the debate. And I think this is why it's all the more important that we don't get into a direction where we have, to some extent, the backlash that we now see against the Energiewende or against the climate policy, where there was the idea that there was like from a headmaster approach telling you this is the right way, and now 2 or 3 years after the climate emergency perceivedly, we see a backlash. So the idea in parts of the Social Democratic Party was also to make this more sustainable, the boiled frog approach. But I agree that that too is problematic because, first of all, there's a logical inconsistency. It is not as clear. I actually think that you can make the argument that secure peace goes with Zeitenwende, is not abandoning Zeitenwende. But the problem is, if you have to explain that for 2 minutes, it doesn't work as a campaign. It's not as clear. The second problem is what we already talked about, is the uncertainty for the defense industry. If it's not entirely clear where we are going, we will not be able to actually get the procurement. I think, worst of all, is that it encourages Russia, because this gradual approach where you're not very clear about what you want to do encourages Russia to think that they can get their will in the end. So where do we go with that? Neither the Hauruck approach works, nor necessarily the gradual approach. And I think this is where it's important to really understand that if we want to anchor Zeitenwende in the lived experience of people, we cannot consider it in an isolated way of foreign affairs. We need to build a broader narrative where Zeitenwende is one part of a broader approach of how to make this country work. And that is to say, security is not just external security, but security works together with domestic security and with social security. It's not butter or cannons, it's butter and cannons. And you cannot have one without the other, because otherwise you will lose the social support for the Zeitenwende. And that is also something that I think some parts in the coalition should understand, that are not necessarily just social democratic, but also to understand that these things cost money, and that if there is a real emergency, which I think there is, you can also call for an emergency when it comes to funding things. The second point, though, is that I think you also need to put it into a positive forward-looking approach. Because that is one thing that psychologists can tell you, and that I've learned also in the campaigning. It's fantastic. I loved it as an academic. I also did this. You criticize because that's good, and you see that, and you're very, very specific, and you see all the bad things, and it's very, very good, and it's necessary to point that out. But that doesn't motivate people, and that is especially not a narrative to motivate voters. It is very clear that you need a positive narrative. You need a narrative of strength, because one thing is if you keep just saying Russia is so mighty and strong and powerful, the reaction will be that they will say, well, then let's have peace. So what we need to say instead is we are strong. Our ideas of the West are strong. We are economically and militarily strong. And we can do this, but to do this, we need to invest into the state. We need to have a state that is able to act, and that has the capacity both militarily, financially, but also politically to act, and that is then to reconsider the state. And I think in this respect, I think Olaf Scholz actually thinks in similar ways. I'm not sure whether Christian Lindner does. The final point I want to end on, though, is that the only way for Zeitenwende to actually work is if it becomes European, is if it is translated into a fully European Zeitenwende. And we've seen the differences between what is happening in the Baltic states and the Nordic states, and then we say on how terrible it is that Germany is only in the middle field. But who's behind Germany? Germany is in the middle field. There is a whole part of Europe that is doing significantly less than Germany. That is no excuse for Germany not to do more. But we need to understand that you need a European solution for two reasons. One is solidarity, because it will be very hard to sell German voters that they need to pay even more. If they then look a couple of kilometers to the west and they see a big rhetoric, but very little money put into it, if there's a sense we do this together, I think it is much more possible to sell this domestically. But I also think in some ways if we Europeanize this, it also depoliticizes the question of Zeitenwende. What we need to achieve is a European consensus similar to the consensus we achieved after the Second World War, where the question was, where is Europe going to be? Where is Germany going to be? Is it going to be located in the West? Or is it going to be neutral? Or is it located towards the East? And I think there was debate about that. We need to have that debate. But then finally, we need to have this consensus, and we need to have it on a European level. And that is what we are going to do over the next 5 years. I know I'm probably already over time. That is a disease that politicians, academics, and diplomats sometimes have in common. But I would very much stress that it is really important to create this positive narrative and to make sure that Zeitenwende is not seen in an isolated way. It has to be anchored at home, and that can only be done in a holistic vision that integrates it into a European and domestic policy agenda. Thank you very much.
We have just a few minutes for questions, and I would like to mention that we have afterwards at 4:30, I'm supposed to stop, we continue talking about the Zeitenwende and the roundtable, but so I have two hands here and here. Yeah, there's one here in the front. Mm-hmm.
So I'm just speaking into it. Okay, my question is just basically, if the idea of depoliticizing Zeitenwende and therefore increasing general like pan-European legitimacy, don't we then risk increasing sort of pan-nationalist ideas around it, and it will only empower populist nationalist movements that we can see, for example, with the AfD, Linke, obviously Marine Le Pen, and obviously here in the UK with Reform. So is there not like a counterbalance to that? And if so, how would you suggest politically going about that to overcome, if you agree? Thank you.
Thank you, but I would collect right away and take 3 questions. Could we pass it on, or could you try to maybe talk without microphone?
Sure, if that's the case, I don't know.
Stand up and yell.
Yeah. Okay, coming.
Thanks so much to all of the speakers. 2 quick, really quick questions. Firstly, we're talking about what we say positive narrative, as you said. Western media, especially within also in the parallel of the Russian disinformation, were so potential, especially, but not only, after 2022, blocks sometimes, and of course make it doubtful. So how do you relate it to change that? Because media is independent power, right? We cannot dictate. So that's my question. Second, very easy, but at the same time complex, Ben. If Zeitenwende didn't happen, what are your 3 points that it should happen? Perhaps now?
And there's in the back, if you could just pass it to the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Mr. Kremer, I applaud your enthusiasm and your optimism. This is a healthy combination, certainly for a young politician with huge tasks ahead of him and his party. I just wonder, you made it sound like in your speech, like you need to motivate the people to get behind the Zeitenwende. And I have the exact opposite impression. That is, the people understand what is at risk, the people understand, the majority at least, what is going on and what is needed to address those challenges. The majority feels threatened by Russia and it demands defense. And you and your party, not you personally, but your party, in, well, having that responsibility, you fail to deliver what people are asking for. And so my question to you is, rather than motivating the people to get behind the Zeitenwende, do you not consider it more important to root out the resistance to Zeitenwende within your own party?
And I would give the last question to Donatas because he has been trying hard.
Thank you very much. Donatas Kupčiūnas, Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics. I'm sorry, I'm filming and asking questions at the same time. So my question is really a fundamental one. How much all this Zeitenwende is real? And you know, we students of geopolitics, we talk in the language of interests. So we know clearly what German interests in Russia are, and these are very substantial interests. You know, it dates back hundreds of years. You know, the combination of German brains, as they would say in the interwar period, and Russian resources makes something formidable. So whether it's cheap Russian gas or Russian minerals or whatever, that's kind of important for Germany. Also, Russia is important for all sorts of other reasons, including peace in the world and so on. So now that that all is supposed to be gone, according at least to Zeitenwende. So I mean, how Germany is going to compensate this with their interests, perhaps in Ukraine? Can German interests in Ukraine compensate for the loss of German interests in Russia? I mean, Ukraine is a large country after all, and so when you look at Ukraine as Germans, what is there to gain for you? Because this is the only way I could, explain Zeitenwende in real terms, in realist terms, and not in sort of a populist virtue signaling. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I would ask you now to respond in 1 minute each.
Okay, you want me to go first? Okay, super questions, thank you. Let me say, I have a hard agree with almost everything that was said there by Tobias.
Basically SPD for you.
Well, it depends. If the SPD moves on those last bits, let's see. And I'm glad you're talking about those other academics who are detached from reality and policy. I work with policy all the time, and I'm a think tanker. And if I ever called myself an academic, I think people in these kind of institutions would be very unhappy with me. But seriously, this notion of a positive vision is absolutely crucial. The notion of integrated thinking about this is absolutely crucial. It's actually almost like you read the pitch for the new project we're setting up in Berlin, the Democratic Strategy Initiative, which seeks to do exactly this. But I'd put it to you, we have a positive vision, we have leadership, we just don't have it in Germany so much. We have it. Actually, there are European leaders, Kaja Kallas, Gabriela Landsbergis, Jan Lipavsky, Donald Tusk. They are leaders. Germany needs to be following them and enabling them and learning how to actually do that. That's Germany's role. That is its role as a team power, which it would be comfortable with playing, that it doesn't actually have to step above the parapet, do the big leadership things which it finds so hard to do. With all the will in the world, Lars Klingbeil can say we're going to be a Führungsmacht as many times as he likes. No one believes it. And Germans don't want it from all the opinion polling. So there is a role you can play by supporting those who do have the vision and by empowering them to achieve it. That's my first point to Victoria as well, which is to say, that is the thing, be a team power. Understand what it means to be a team player, which means fundamentally to commit to the team goal, winning in Ukraine. Second thing is understand that actually our values are our fundamental interests, not marginal interests as they have been treated as, and that goes to the point at the back. This is something, if we follow those and pursue them as our fundamental interests, we will come a lot closer to the kind of geopolitical seriousness that we need in order to understand what the systemic competition is based on and how to win it. And again, that would align us with the Baltics and others. Last thing is get serious on geoeconomics. You cannot continue to undermine your position in the world through making a quick buck with China while at the same time trying to get serious about security.
Now I've got another few questions in addition to the questions that I already meant to answer. I'll try to be very brief. Very first thing, I agree with you. You are preaching to the choir. I was the Baltics desk officer, like empowering Baltic voices in also in Germany, but I think throughout all of Europe. It was my job until 4 days ago, and I think it is not a bad thing that Kaja Kallas will be the permanent high representative. I will say, though, you mentioned a couple of politicians who have vision and who have said very clearly what the Zeitenwende is about. And what did these politicians have in common? They border Russia and Poland. You haven't mentioned anybody from Spain or from Italy or from Belgium. And I think that is actually essential because these are politicians who, and that is where politicians operate. We operate in the reality that we are accountable to our voters. And there is some part of leadership, but you have to interact with your voters in their lived experience. You can then make a case and move in some ways. But it's much easier for Kaja Kallas to have a vision because she knows 90% of Estonians behind. There's not much convincing you need to do in Estonia if you talk about the Russian threat. There's not much convincing you need to do in Lithuania if there's the Russian threat. You will have to do much more convincing in Germany, and you have to think much more like strategically and also carefully about what it means that you don't immediately go 2-3 steps too far and then have the risk of a backlash. And I think that is important, and that there is a difference in that. I want to briefly address some of the, I think we'll have a long discussion later, very, very briefly, just because somebody asked me to root out opposition in the SPD. I am actually quite glad to be in a democratic party where we don't root out ideological differences and opposition. In this, I mean, but it's very clear. We have these debates in the party, and I actually think that we can have these debates in the party, and the party has been very, very clear. And in this respect, I'm actually also quite proud of this party that it has been so clear. If you actually read our manifesto from December 2023, we've been very clear about our own mistakes. I have not seen anything of the sort from Angela Merkel, for instance, about her own bits. So one part, but I don't want to root out opposition in the SPD. I want to have these debates in the SPD because it does actually represent a part of the German population. And yes, you might have a majority for some things of Zeitenwende, but there is, for instance, a massive majority against Taurus. That does not mean that we don't have to have, that we shouldn't have Taurus. We can have that debate. But I want this debate to be had in a democratic party. I don't want the AfD and the Sarah Wagenknecht party to be the only parties that have this argument, and that people then feel if they are not entirely sure about Zeitenwende, they can only go to the far right. No, we have to have these debates within democratic parties, and this is why I'm glad we have that. I'm very clear on where I stand, and I think we can make that argument, but I don't want ideologically homogeneous, like gleichgeschaltete parties. That is not necessarily my idea of German politics, as it is not my idea of the German population. I could keep talking, but I will stop.
Thank you.
Yeah, also just a brief response to the notion that majorities feel threatened by Russia and demand defense. I think it's true in the aggregate, but if you look into East-West divides, you do find majorities against both notions in the East. And I'm not a politician, but I imagine that being one, looking at this from Berlin, it's a severe constraint to devise a policy that is not carried by the new lender, and you would deepen the cleavage between East and West by moving on without having sufficient support in both parts of the country. So I wouldn't underestimate this East-West divide and how it plays into Berlin politics when it comes to Zeitenwende.
Then let me thank you for the panelists for a great discussion.